Some things aren't lost, they're just waiting for the right person to find them. The wind moved quietly through the empty parking lot behind the shuttered convenience store, carrying with it the faint scent of rain and rust, the kind of smell that clung to forgotten places where time had quietly stepped aside. And beneath the dim flicker of a broken streetlight, Daniel Mercer sat in the driver's seat of his old pickup, hands resting loosely on the worn steering wheel, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the cracked windshield, as if he were listening to something only memory could say. He was 40, though the lines across his face suggested a life that had stretched longer than years alone could measure. His dark brown hair threaded lightly with gray at the temples, his jaw shadowed by a few days' stubble, and his broad shoulders carried the quiet weight of someone who had learned how to endure without asking why. Beside him, Ranger shifted slightly on the passenger seat, the 6-year-old German shepherd lifting his head just enough for his amber eyes to catch the light. Alert but calm, as if the silence itself had meaning, the dog's ears twitched once, then again, not in response to a sound Daniel could hear, but to something deeper, something that brushed against instinct like a distant echo. Daniel exhaled slowly, the breath fogging faintly in the cool night air. "You hear something, boy," he murmured, though he already knew the answer. Ranger didn't bark, didn't growl, he simply watched, his gaze fixed toward the edge of the lot where the darkness seemed just a little too still. And for a moment, Daniel considered ignoring it, because ignoring things had become easier over the years, easier than hoping, easier than believing that anything unexpected could still matter. But Ranger rose to his feet, stepping down from the seat with quiet purpose, his paws landing softly against the gravel as he moved toward the edge of the light. And something in that movement, something steady and certain, pulled Daniel from his thoughts. He opened the truck door, the hinges creaking softly as he stepped out into the night, the air cool against his skin, the world holding its breath in that strange, suspended way it sometimes did before something changed. Ranger stopped near a rusted metal dumpster, nose low, tail still, and Daniel approached slowly, boots crunching against loose gravel, his eyes scanning the ground until he saw it. A piece of folded paper, worn at the edges, half tucked beneath a loose board as if it had been placed there deliberately, or perhaps simply left behind by chance. Though something about it didn't feel accidental. He crouched, fingers brushing the paper, hesitating just long enough to feel the faintest trace of uncertainty, the kind that comes when life offers something you didn't ask for. Then he picked it up, unfolding it carefully, the paper crackling softly in the quiet, lines stretched across its surface, faded ink forming shapes that didn't immediately make sense. Not streets, not highways, something older, something less precise, but somehow more intentional. Ranger stepped closer, his body tense now, a low sound building in his chest, not fear, not warning, but recognition, as if the dog understood something Daniel could not yet see. The wind shifted then, just slightly, carrying a new chill across the lot, and Daniel stared at the map, his brow tightening, because deep down, in a place he had spent years trying to quiet, something stirred, a feeling he hadn't trusted in a long time. Not hope exactly, but the faint suggestion of direction. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, the road ahead no longer felt completely empty, as if somewhere beyond the edges of that worn paper, something was waiting, patient and unseen, for him to take the first step. The map felt heavier the longer he held it, not in weight but in presence, as if the paper carried more than ink and age. And Daniel stood there for a moment longer than he intended, the quiet stretching around him, while Ranger remained fixed at his side, eyes locked on the markings as though they were something alive, something speaking in a language older than words. Daniel folded the map carefully and slipped it into the inside pocket of his worn jacket, his fingers lingering for just a second before he pulled away, the habit of caution still stitched deep into him. But as he turned back toward the truck, something in the air had shifted, subtle but undeniable, like the world had adjusted by a fraction of an inch, just enough to be felt, but not explained. The drive that followed was not long in miles, but it felt different in rhythm. The old engine humming steadily as the tires rolled across cracked asphalt, streetlights passing in slow intervals. And Ranger sat upright now, no longer resting, his posture alert, his ears catching sounds Daniel could not hear. his gaze drifting occasionally toward the pocket where the map rested, as if making sure it had not disappeared, as if it mattered that it stayed. Daniel glanced at him once, then back at the road. "You are not letting this go, are you?" he said quietly, his voice carrying a faint edge of something unfamiliar. Not doubt exactly, but not certainty either. More like the feeling of standing at the edge of something that could change everything or nothing at all. And the dog responded only by shifting slightly closer, his presence steady, unwavering, like a silent agreement that whatever this was, it was not meant to be ignored. They drove until the town lights faded behind them, and the road narrowed into a long stretch of blacktop cutting through open land, fields stretching wide under a sky scattered with stars. The kind of sky that made a man feel small in a way that was not entirely uncomfortable. Daniel pulled over near a quiet turnout. The kind truckers used to rest for a few hours, and killed the engine. The sudden silence settling around them like a blanket, he leaned back in the seat, exhaling slowly, his hand instinctively brushing against the map through the fabric of his jacket. And for a moment he closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to think. Though thinking had never quite been the right word for what he did in moments like this, it was more like listening, waiting to see if anything inside him still knew how to recognize. A direction, Ranger shifted again, this time letting out a low, soft sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a whine, something in between, and Daniel opened his eyes, turning his head slightly. The dog was staring out the windshield, his body rigid, his focus drawn toward the dark stretch of land just beyond the turnout. Daniel followed his gaze, seeing nothing at first but the outline of tall grass moving gently in the wind. Then something caught his attention, not movement exactly, but the absence of it, a patch of land where the grass did not sway the same way, where the shadows seemed to settle differently. Like a piece of the world that did not quite belong to the rest. Daniel frowned, leaning forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of it. And without fully deciding to, he reached into his jacket and pulled out the map again, unfolding it across the steering wheel, the paper catching the faint glow of the dashboard lights. And this time, something stood out that he had not noticed before, a faint line, almost invisible, drawn near the edge of the page, intersecting with a small marking that resembled nothing he could name. But as he looked from the map to the land ahead, a quiet realization settled in his chest. Not loud, not dramatic, just certain, the kind of certainty that does not ask for permission, only for action. Ranger let out a single, soft bark, the kind he only made when something mattered, and Daniel nodded once, almost to himself. "All right," he whispered, his voice steady now, though he could not explain why. "We will take a look." And as he opened the truck door and stepped out into the cool night air, the ground beneath his boots felt just a little different, as if the first step had already been taken long before he realized it. The ground felt firmer than it should have as Daniel stepped away from the truck, the gravel giving way to a narrow stretch of earth that seemed almost untouched despite the open land around it. And the wind, which had been moving steadily across the fields moments ago, softened here, as if it had chosen to pass around this place instead of through it. Ranger moved ahead without hesitation, his body low and focused, each step deliberate, his nose close to the ground, but his ears still alert, listening for something beneath the silence. Daniel followed a few paces behind, his boots pressing into the soil, noticing how the texture changed with every step, patches of dry grass giving way to firmer ground, then to something almost packed, as though it had once been walked on many times long ago, and then simply forgotten. The stars above cast a faint silver glow across the land, just enough to outline shapes, but not enough to explain them. And as they moved farther from the road, the sense of distance shifted, not in miles, but in feeling, like crossing an invisible line between what was known and what was waiting to be remembered. Daniel reached into his jacket again, pulling out the map and holding it loosely in one hand, comparing its faded lines to the shapes around him. And for the first time, the markings began to make a kind of sense, not precise, not exact, but aligned in a way that felt intentional, as if the map had never been meant for accuracy but for recognition. Ranger stopped suddenly, his body going still, his head lifting slightly as he stared at a point just ahead where the ground dipped almost imperceptibly. Daniel slowed, his breath quieting as he approached, his eyes narrowing as he tried to see what the dog already understood. At first it looked like nothing more than a shallow depression, a slight unevenness in the earth where grass grew thinner and the soil showed through in faint lines. But then he noticed the pattern, subtle edges where the ground seemed to have been shaped rather than formed naturally. A rectangle just beneath the surface, worn smooth by time, yet still present enough to be felt. Daniel crouched slowly, brushing his fingers across the dirt, the texture different here, cooler somehow, as if it held on to something the rest of the ground had long since released. Ranger let out a low, steady sound, not warning but insistence, and began to paw gently at the edge of the shape, not digging wildly but with purpose, as though he knew exactly where to press. Daniel watched for a moment, then set the map aside carefully and joined him, clearing away loose soil with his hands, the earth giving way easier than expected, small fragments shifting aside to reveal something beneath, not stone, not wood, but metal, darkened with age. Its surface worn but unmistakably shaped by human hands. Daniel paused, his fingers resting against it, feeling the faint chill that lingered there despite the mild night air, and for a moment, everything around him seemed to fall quiet in a deeper way, the kind of silence that carries weight rather than absence. Ranger stepped back slightly, watching him now, his eyes steady, almost expectant, as if the next move belonged to Daniel alone. Daniel exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, his mind pulling at memories of places like this, of hidden things and the patience they required. But this felt different, not like something concealed out of fear or protection, but something left behind with intention, something meant to be found when the time was right. He brushed away the last layer of dirt along one edge, revealing a faint outline of a handle set flush into the metal surface, simple, functional, waiting. And as his hand hovered just above it, he felt that same quiet certainty settle deeper within him, not forcing him forward, not urging him back, simply reminding him that some doors are not opened by accident. They are opened by the ones who choose to see them. Ranger's tail moved once, slow and steady, and Daniel lowered his hand, his fingers closing around the handle, the cool metal grounding him in the moment as he prepared to lift whatever had been waiting beneath the surface for longer than either of them could know. The handle did not resist him when he pulled, and that alone told Daniel more than he expected, because things buried this long usually held on, as if time itself had weight. But this moved with a quiet willingness, the metal door lifting just enough to break the seal of earth around it, releasing a faint breath of air from below, cool and steady, carrying a scent that was neither decay nor dust, but something cleaner, almost preserved, like a place that had been closed not to be forgotten but to be kept. Daniel paused with the hatch only a few inches open, his hand still gripping the handle as he listened, not for danger, not for noise, but for that subtle shift he had learned to trust, the kind that told him whether to continue or step back. Ranger stepped closer again, his posture calm now, his earlier tension replaced by something quieter, something closer to recognition than concern. The dog lowered his head slightly, drawing in a slow breath from the opening, then looked back at Daniel with steady eyes, and that was enough. Daniel lifted the hatch the rest of the way, setting it gently against the ground beside the opening, revealing a narrow descent beneath. Not a deep shaft or a rough hole, but a constructed space, the edges lined with reinforced panels, aged but intact, leading down into a darkness that did not feel empty. The faint outline of steps emerged as his eyes adjusted, descending at a shallow angle, each one evenly spaced, each one built with intention. He reached back into the truck briefly, retrieving the small flashlight he kept in the glove compartment, the beam cutting through the darkness below in a narrow column of pale light, revealing more detail, smooth walls, a handrail on one side, faint markings along the edges that looked less like warnings and more like guidance, as if whoever built this place had expected someone to follow. Daniel stood at the edge for a moment longer, the map resting now on the seat behind him, its purpose fulfilled in a way he had not yet fully understood. Ranger placed one paw on the first step, then another, testing the surface before moving forward without hesitation, his nails clicking softly against the material, the sound echoing faintly down the passage. Daniel followed, his movements careful but steady, the beam of light shifting with each step, illuminating a space that felt untouched by time in a way that was difficult to explain. The air remained cool, but not stale, the temperature consistent as though the world above had little influence here. And with each step downward, the noise of the outside world faded completely, replaced by a quiet that felt almost deliberate. Not empty, but held, like a pause between thoughts. The passage leveled out after about 20 feet, opening into a wider chamber that caused Daniel to slow, his light sweeping across the space, revealing walls lined with shelves, metal, and wood combined in a way that suggested both function and care. Objects rested there, not scattered, not abandoned, but placed, each one in its own position as though part of a system rather than a collection. Boxes, sealed containers, tools that looked older but well-maintained. And in the center of the room stood a table, simple but sturdy, its surface clear except for one item, a small wooden box, polished smooth despite the years, its edges worn just enough to show it had been handled before. Daniel approached slowly. The sound of his boots softened by the floor beneath him, Ranger circling once before settling near the base of the table. His body relaxed now, his earlier alertness replaced by a calm that seemed almost assured. Daniel stopped a few feet away, his eyes fixed on the box, and for a moment, he did not reach for it, because something about the space, about the quiet order of it all, suggested that whatever lay inside was not meant to be rushed, that some discoveries ask for patience not because they are fragile, but because they are meant to be understood. And as he stood there, the faintest sensation settled over him, not of being watched, but of being expected, as if the place itself had been waiting not just for anyone, but for someone willing to arrive without certainty and stay long enough to see what truly remained. Daniel did not move right away, his gaze resting on the small wooden box as if it carried more weight than its size suggested, the quiet in the room pressing gently against him, not urging, not demanding, but waiting, the way certain moments do when they know they will not come again in the same way twice. Ranger shifted slightly beside the table, his tail brushing once against the floor in a slow, deliberate motion, not restless, not impatient, simply present, and that quiet presence steadied something inside Daniel that had been unsettled for longer than he cared to admit. He stepped forward at last, each movement measured, his boots making almost no sound against the smooth surface beneath him. And when he reached the table, he rested his hand lightly on the edge first, grounding himself in the reality of the moment before reaching for the box itself. The wood felt warm despite the cool air around it, worn smooth along the corners as though it had been opened many times before. And for a brief second, Daniel hesitated, not out of fear, but out of respect for something he could not yet name. Then he lifted the lid, slowly, carefully, the hinges offering only the faintest whisper of sound as they moved. Inside, there was no gold, no jewels, nothing that would immediately suggest value to someone passing through. Instead, the box held a stack of neatly arranged papers, aged but preserved, along with a small metal object that caught the beam of his flashlight with a soft reflection. Daniel leaned closer, setting the light down so it rested against the edge of the table, freeing both hands as he reached inside, lifting the top sheet gently, the paper firm despite its years, the ink still clear, the handwriting steady and deliberate, not rushed, not careless. As if every word had been placed with intention, he began to read, his eyes moving slowly across the lines, and as he did, the room seemed to shift in a way that had nothing to do with space and everything to do with understanding. The words spoke not of treasure or fortune, but of purpose, of a place built to hold something that mattered not because of what it was worth, but because of what it could become in the right hands. Ranger moved closer, his head resting briefly against Daniel's leg, a quiet gesture that carried more reassurance than any spoken words could. Daniel continued reading, each sentence revealing pieces of a story left behind by someone who had chosen not to take their work with them, but to leave it for someone else to find, someone who would not arrive by accident, someone who would listen before acting, who would see before claiming. And as Daniel reached the end of the first page, his hand lowered slightly, his breath slower now, more deliberate, the weight he had carried for so long shifting in a way that was difficult to define, not lifting entirely, but settling into something steadier, something that felt less like a burden and more like a path. He set the paper down carefully and reached for the small metal object, turning it over in his hand. Its surface cool and solid, shaped like a key but unlike any he had seen before. Its edges engraved with the same faint markings that had appeared on the map, symbols that no longer felt random. And for a moment, Daniel simply stood there, the box open before him, the room quiet around him, the dog steady at his side, and he realized that whatever this place held, whatever it had been meant for, it was not about what could be taken from it, but what could be carried forward. And in that realization, something within him, something that had been silent for far too long, began to respond, not loudly, not all at once, but enough to remind him that sometimes the most valuable things are not found in what is hidden, but in what is entrusted to those willing to stay. Daniel remained still for a long moment, the key resting in his palm, its weight subtle yet undeniable, as if it carried not just form but intention, and the room around him seemed to respond in a quiet, almost imperceptible way, the air holding steady, the silence deepening not into emptiness, but into something closer to presence. Ranger lifted his head slightly, his ears tilting forward as though he, too, sensed the shift. And without needing direction, the dog turned toward the far wall of the chamber, his gaze settling on a section that at first appeared no different from the rest. But the longer Daniel looked, the more he noticed the difference. Faint lines along the surface, edges too clean to be natural, a seam that had been hidden not by force but by patience. Daniel stepped closer, his boots echoing softly now, each step measured, his hand closing more firmly around the key as the quiet certainty returned. Not as a command, but as a recognition. He reached the wall and paused, studying it, his fingers brushing lightly across the surface until they found a small indentation, barely visible, shaped in a way that mirrored the form of the key he held. Ranger let out a soft breath, his tail still, his body calm, and Daniel understood without needing to question it. He raised the key and aligned it with the indentation, the motion slow, deliberate, as if the moment itself required care. And when the metal met metal, there was no resistance, no mechanical struggle, only a soft click that echoed through the chamber like a signal long awaited. The wall did not open immediately. Instead, a low hum moved through the space, not loud, not alarming, but steady, like something awakening rather than reacting. And then, almost seamlessly, the section of wall shifted inward before sliding aside, revealing another room beyond, smaller but more defined, illuminated by a faint, warm light that seemed to come from within the walls themselves, not electric, not flickering, but constant. Daniel stepped forward slowly, the light catching his face as he entered, revealing a space that felt less like storage and more like purpose. A workroom, though not in the usual sense, shelves lined with carefully organized documents, tools that appeared designed for precision rather than labor, and along one side, a series of framed maps, more detailed than the one he had found, each marked with similar symbols, each pointing to places that likely did not exist on any modern chart. Ranger moved beside him, his earlier intensity replaced now by a quiet attentiveness, his head turning as he took in the room, as if confirming what Daniel had begun to understand. This was not a single discovery, not a one-time find. It was part of something larger, something that had been built to continue beyond the one who created it. Daniel approached the nearest map, his eyes scanning the markings, recognizing patterns now that had once seemed random. And as he reached out to touch the glass, he felt that same steady pull, not toward possession, but toward responsibility. He glanced back toward the first room, toward the open box on the table, the papers still waiting, and then back to the maps before him. The realization settling fully now. This place had never been about hiding something valuable. It had been about preserving something meaningful, something meant to be carried forward by someone who would not simply take it, but understand it. And as Daniel stood there, the weight he had carried for so long shifted again, not disappearing, but transforming into something steadier, something that felt less like the past and more like a path ahead. Ranger stepped closer, pressing lightly against his side, grounding him in the moment, and Daniel nodded once, not to the dog, not to the room, but to the quiet understanding that had found him here, because for the first time in years, he was no longer standing still, He was standing at the beginning of something that had been waiting longer than he had known how to look. Daniel moved slowly along the row of framed maps, his eyes tracing the fine lines and unfamiliar symbols, each one carrying the same quiet precision as the one that had led him here. But now they felt different, no longer distant or abstract. They felt connected, like pieces of something larger that had been waiting to be seen together. Ranger stayed close, his presence steady, his movements calm, as though whatever urgency had guided them to this place had softened into something more grounded, something meant to last rather than rush. Daniel paused at one map in particular, its markings denser, the lines intersecting in a pattern that felt deliberate in a way the others did not. And as he leaned closer, he noticed a small notation along the edge, faint but readable, not a name, not a date, but a phrase, simple and clear. Only continue if you are willing to return. Daniel's brow tightened slightly as he read it again, the words settling into him with a weight that was not heavy, but undeniable. He stepped back just a fraction, his gaze shifting across the room, taking in the shelves, the tools, the quiet order of everything that had been left behind. And for the first time since opening the hatch, a question rose fully to the surface, not about what this place was, but about what it required. Ranger let out a soft breath, his head turning toward Daniel, his eyes steady, not urging, not questioning, simply present in a way that made the moment clearer. Daniel exhaled slowly, his hand resting lightly against the edge of the map, and in that pause, memories surfaced, not sharp or overwhelming, but steady, the kind that carried both weight and distance, long roads, empty rooms, decisions made without direction, and the quiet understanding that had followed him for years, that surviving was not the same as living. He looked back at the phrase once more, letting it settle deeper, willing to return, not to a place, not to a location on a map, but to something within himself that he had left behind long ago, something that had felt too uncertain, too fragile to carry forward at the time. Ranger stepped closer, pressing gently against his leg, grounding him in the present. And Daniel reached down absent-mindedly, his hand resting briefly on the dog's neck, the familiar warmth steadying him. He straightened again, his gaze clearer now, and turned slightly toward the shelves along the wall, where more documents waited, more pieces of a story that had not ended, only paused. He walked toward them, his movements no longer hesitant but deliberate. And as he picked up another set of papers, he noticed the same handwriting, the same careful attention to detail. Instructions not in the form of commands, but in observations, notes about places, about people, about choices that had been made and the outcomes that had followed. It was not a guide in the traditional sense. It was something more personal, more reflective, as if the one who had written it had understood that what mattered was not just what you found, but what you did with it afterward. Daniel read slowly, each line drawing him further into a perspective he had not expected, one that did not measure value in what could be taken, but in what could be given, and how. Something discovered could continue beyond the moment it was found. Ranger circled once and settled near the center of the room, his body relaxed, his breathing steady, and Daniel glanced toward him briefly, a faint shift in his expression, not quite a smile, but something close, something lighter than before. And as he lowered the papers, his eyes moved once more across the room, across the maps, the tools, the quiet structure of it all. And he understood now that this was not the end of a journey. It was the beginning of one that would require more than following directions. It would require choice, intention, and the willingness to step forward not just for himself, but for something that extended beyond him. And in that understanding, the space no longer felt unfamiliar. It felt like something he could grow into, something he could carry, not because he had been chosen, but because he had chosen to stay. Daniel stood quietly in the center of the room, the papers still in his hands, but his attention no longer fixed on the words alone. Instead, it moved between the space around him and the understanding slowly taking shape within him, the kind of understanding that does not arrive all at once, but settles piece by piece until it becomes something steady, something undeniable. Ranger remained nearby, his presence calm and grounded, as though the dog had already accepted what this place meant long before Daniel found the words for it. The soft light along the walls continued to glow without flicker, casting a warm, even tone across the maps and shelves, and in that steady illumination, the room no longer felt hidden. It felt revealed, not just to the eyes, but to intention. Daniel lowered the papers back onto the shelf with care, aligning them exactly as he had found them, not out of habit, but out of respect for the order that had been preserved here for so long. And as his hand moved away, he noticed something he had not seen before, a small marking etched into the wood of the shelf itself, subtle and almost invisible unless you were looking closely, a symbol that matched the one engraved on the key still resting in his other hand. He leaned in slightly, tracing the shape with his eyes, and then, almost instinctively, he placed the key against it, not inserting it, not forcing it, just resting it there. And for a brief moment, nothing happened. The room remained still, the light unchanged, the silence unbroken. But then, slowly, the surface beneath the key responded, not with sound, but with movement, the wood shifting just enough to reveal a thin seam that had been hidden within the grain. Daniel stepped back slightly as a narrow compartment slid open beneath the shelf, revealing a second box, smaller than the first, darker in color, its surface marked with the same careful wear. Ranger lifted his head, his ears tilting forward as he watched, his body still relaxed but attentive. Daniel reached down and lifted the box from its place, feeling the same quiet weight settle into his hands. Not heavy, but meaningful. He brought it to the table in the center of the room and set it down gently, his movements deliberate, unhurried, as if he understood now that this place did not respond to urgency. It responded to presence. He opened the box slowly, the lid revealing its contents in the soft light. Inside was a single item, a folded piece of paper, thicker than the others, sealed with a simple band. Daniel removed it carefully, unwrapping it with steady hands, and as he unfolded it, the words written there were fewer, but clearer than anything he had read before. If you are here, then you have already chosen more than you realize. Daniel read the line once, then again, the meaning settling deeper each time, not as a statement, but as a reflection of something he had not fully acknowledged until now, that every step, every pause, every decision to continue instead of turn back had led him here, not by accident, but by willingness. Ranger stepped closer, his head lifting slightly as he looked up at Daniel, and for the first time since entering this place, Daniel allowed a quiet shift to reach his expression, not a full smile, but something close, something that carried both weight and relief. He folded the paper again, holding it for a moment before placing it back into the box, and as he did, he realized that whatever came next would not be written for him in the same way. The maps, the notes, the guidance would remain, but the path itself would require something more, something that could not be left behind or handed down. It would require him to decide not just where to go, but why. And as he looked around the room one more time, the shelves, the maps, the quiet order of it all no longer felt like a mystery waiting to be solved. It felt like a foundation waiting to be used, and in that realization, the weight he had carried for so long settled into something steadier, something that did not pull him backward, but quietly, patiently, pointed him forward. Daniel stood for a long moment after closing the box, his hand resting lightly against its surface as if committing the shape of it to memory. The room around him unchanged and yet no longer the same, because it was not the space that had shifted, it was him, the quiet weight that had followed him for years now settling into something steadier, something that no longer pressed down but instead held him upright. Ranger moved closer and sat beside the table, his posture relaxed, his breathing slow and even, as though the long tension that had guided them here had finally found its place. Daniel glanced at him, the faintest trace of warmth passing through his expression, and without thinking, he reached down and rested his hand briefly on the dog's head, a simple gesture, but one that carried a quiet acknowledgement of everything they had walked through together. The silence in the room no longer felt like something waiting to be broken. It felt complete, like the final note of a song that did not need to continue in order to be understood. Daniel lifted the box once more, then set it back exactly where it belonged, aligning it with care, not because he had to, but because it felt right to leave things as they had been found. Only now, with the knowledge that they would not remain untouched, he turned toward the maps again, his eyes moving across them not as mysteries, but as possibilities, each one representing a path that could be taken, not for gain, not for proof, but for purpose. And in that moment, he understood that this place was never meant to be owned. It was meant to be continued. Ranger stood as Daniel stepped back toward the passage, the dog falling into step beside him without hesitation. And together they moved through the room, past the shelves, past the quiet order that had been preserved through time, and into the narrow corridor that led upward. The climb felt different now, the steps no longer uncertain but steady, each one carrying the sense of movement not away from something, but toward something that had yet to fully unfold. When they reached the surface, the night air greeted them with a gentle chill, the open sky stretching wide above, the stars still scattered like distant markers across the dark, and for a moment, Daniel simply stood there, the hatch open behind him, the world ahead quiet and unchanged, yet somehow fuller than before. He closed the hatch carefully, brushing the loose earth back into place, restoring the ground to its quiet, unremarkable state, not hiding it, but respecting it. And when he stepped back, there was no visible sign of what lay beneath, only the faint memory of where it had been. Ranger walked a few steps ahead, then paused, turning his head slightly, as if waiting, and Daniel followed, not out of habit, but with intention. The truck sat where he had left it, the worn metal catching the faint light of the stars, and as he opened the door and climbed inside, he did not reach immediately for the ignition. Instead, he sat for a moment, his hands resting on the steering wheel, his eyes looking out across the open land, no longer searching, but considering. The map still rested on the seat, but it no longer felt like the beginning of something unknown. It felt like the first of many directions, and as he picked it up once more, folding it carefully, he understood that what mattered now was not where it would lead, but how he would walk the path it offered. Ranger settled into his place beside him, calm and steady, and Daniel finally turned the key, the engine coming to life with its familiar sound, the road ahead stretching into the distance, quiet and waiting. And as the truck began to move, there was no urgency in his pace, no need to rush toward what came next, because for the first time in a long while, he was not driving to escape. He was moving forward with something he had almost forgotten how to carry, a sense of direction that did not come from the map alone, but from the quiet decision to follow it, wherever it might lead. And in that steady motion beneath the open sky, the journey did not feel like something that had begun or ended. It felt like something that had finally found its way back.